Hi Krishna, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may happen to be in the world. Thank you for coming and joining in with part 2, co-creating the future of the Krishna Consciousness Movement. I'm joined again by Krishnendra Prabhu. Thank you, Prabhu.
Hare Krishna.
And last time we looked at how Lord Chaitanya started the movement. It wasn't an institution in those days. We looked at the first major contraction with the Sahaja movements, more or less derailing the movement for a while. We looked at the restoration through Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, and then we looked at the miraculous bringing of Krishna consciousness to the Western world, and many of Srila Prabhupada's visionary, his visions, and also his wonderful style of really empowering people to spread Krishna consciousness. Today we're going to cover off the rest of the history through till the modern day. So it's this turbulent period just after Srila Prabhupada left, right through till now. And I guess all the way through, the purpose of looking at the history is what lessons can we learn to look into the future. And then we will maybe start, we're going to go for a little less time period this time, maybe just 90 minutes or something. We will start looking at what are we doing right, even right now, or at least what have we demonstrated that we can do well, that we can further amplify and continue or restore. I doubt we'll get further, so there will be a part 3. Krishnendra, I'll pass to you if you've got any sort of positioning or summary or anything else you want to say right at the beginning.
Well, I just think it's a good process to reflect on history so that we can learn from it. What's the saying? The only thing we learn from history is that no one learns anything from history or something?
Yeah. And it is scary sometimes to see us repeating old patterns. So this first item, the transition of parampara into the hands of very young devotees. I was just doing some calculations on the back of an envelope the other day. When I joined the movement, as in moved into the ashram age 17, the movement was only 18. So it was a very short period. And at the time in 1977, when Srila Prabhupada left, perhaps the oldest devotees were devotees of 11, 12 years, many of them less than 10. And some of those early gurus, although trusted lieutenants of Srila Prabhupada, had been devotees 10 years. I'm trying to imagine what kind of guru I would have been in 1994 after just 10 years of practice. Love to hear your thoughts, Krishnendra, and let's really unpack the whole challenges that we've had with succession.
Yeah, it's what you were talking about. It occurred to me as well at one point where I realized that I was the same age as Guru Maharaj was when he initiated me. And it kind of blew my mind, really.
And just so people know, we're both disciples of Bhakti Swami.
Yes. So he would have been, I guess, 50 when he initiated me.
Yeah, I think he was born in 45.
45, so, yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he would have been 50, and I'm a few years past 50, but, yeah, it just feels weird. But as time goes by, and, again, we're talking about growing into different generations, things will be different. And they already are different.
Well, here's a scary one that I thought of. Srila Prabhupada met Srila Bhaktisiddhanta in 1922, and he came west 43 years later.
Wow.
I think I'm at year 41 of being a part of the movement. We've lost you, Krishnendra. What has happened? Are you still there? In terms of between initiation, Prabhupada was initiated, was it in 33? And that means he came west after 32 years of initiation. Well, that's not quite as long as I've been initiated. It's very sobering when you think about things like that. Krishnendra, I'm not sure what's happened. Maybe, I don't know if you can hear me. I might remove you and add you again and see what happens. All right. Well, hopefully Krishnendu will be back very shortly. Sorry about that. So Srila Prabhupada was afforded 12 years in the West. And as we know, he did something spectacular in that time. There you go. You're back on your phone.
My fancy Mac decided to overheat and just spit the donut.
So, yeah, I was just saying Srila Prabhupada in the West was afforded 12 years by Krishna. All the while throughout his teachings, he's preparing his followers to become transparent via media themselves, to become competent to pass on the science of Krishna consciousness, to understand it's their responsibility. If we just read Srila Prabhupada's books, we wouldn't have any doubt that the whole idea is that disciples in due course are meant to become spiritual teachers and accept their own disciples. That is the way. Of course, we have to become fit to do that. It's amazing that there's been so much controversy about how succession should continue. And I suspect a lot of this is around the performance of those first 11. Of course, there's controversy about how they came to be gurus and what claims were made and how they carried themselves in those new roles as gurus, whether it was only ever meant to be those 11. And of course, we now have all kinds of theories like, well, Prabhupada intended to continue as the initiator with people just acting as proxies, or some going, well, there's no one in the ISKCON society that's qualified. We have to look at senior Vaishnavas from other traditions. Again, I'll pause, Nandu, to see if you have any thoughts.
It's interesting, and I think it comes back to a particular dynamic of institutions that traditionally, and this is I find it quite funny, the GBC recently commissioned an investigation into what Shastra has to say about the process of vetting gurus, you could say.
Oh, yeah.
And then the conclusion was that, well, actually in Shastra, it just says that the guru and disciple need to spend some time assessing each other before, taking the decision to get initiation. There was no oversight by any managerial body. So the GBC's response was, could you research a little bit more and see if you can find something?
We don't like that answer. Of course, there weren't institutions of this scale. So, of course, Shastra won't be making those comments. We are charting new territory in that aspect. So maybe let's look at chronologically what did happen and how the... sorry.
I just thought I'd just chip in a little bit more here, is that there's a issue that comes up which is called parallel lines of authority, which is also an issue that you've got kind of a managerial body, like say a temple president or something like that, the authority of the temple who makes the decisions, and then someone gets initiated by a different person, and then that person tells them, oh, you should do this and you should do that, and then sometimes it doesn't agree, it contradicts each other, and so this parallel line of authority can cause issues. And I think that this is the challenge that ISKCON faces, that we have the traditional guru-disciple type of relationship, but then you also have this institution, and how do they combine together? I have some thoughts on that. Maybe we could talk about it later on.
Yeah, we're definitely interested. That's exactly why you're here, to share your wise musings in this regard. So our goal here isn't to necessarily provide a definitive answer. Again, we're looking at history in the sense of what can we learn. We're not going to try and litigate all of the issues, that the different sides of the story, but let's look a little bit chronologically. So in May of 1977, Srila Prabhupada's health was, declining to some extent. And
You got slides for this one? Or
what's that?
you had slides for this? Because I can just see you at the moment. I thought maybe you had some
No, that's
slides.
right. I'll put the slides up. I mean, there's nothing animated
Easy.
going on in the slides.
Okay, no.
We're talking about the green mangoes. We haven't even got to the green mango slide yet.
Yeah, okay, no.
So Satsvarup Maharaj, I believe Tamal Krishna Maharaj, there might have been some others who were there, asked Srila Prabhupada. This was quite a famous conversation. So we're wondering what will happen after you leave us, to the process of initiation and so on. At that time already, there was some kind of local leaders were initiating on Srila Prabhupada's behalf. So there were so many people joining the movement that they needed a proxy system, which, and this is where I believe the word Ritvik was really introduced by Tamal Krishna in this conversation. But now they wanted to know, so what will happen after you leave? Srila Prabhupada indicated, I'll name some of you. They can initiate on my behalf for the next few months. And after I leave, they'll initiate, and it looks to me at least fairly straightforward. After I leave, they'll initiate disciples who'll become their disciples, my grand disciples, and so on. And we know that maybe a couple of days later, that list came out. I think it might have even been added to slightly. I think Hamsadutta had been doing something with challenging a scientist in Sri Lanka somewhere, so he got added to the list. So Srila Prabhupada came up with that initial list of people who could represent him between now and when he would leave, and the understanding that they would initiate. And I also understood that, more could be added in future. I understood that that was always the case. So it was never meant to be them exclusively and so on. I'll pause just to see if you have any comments around this, Krishnandaji.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just yesterday, I was reading a letter in 1973 where Prabhupada is writing to say, yes, I've accepted these particular people to be my disciples. He gave their birth name and he gave their initiated names. And he had posted the Japamala to them through the mail. So even in 1973, initiations were happening like that. It wasn't like that they were physically present at the yagya, which I thought was interesting. Yeah.
So
that was just showing how this kind of initiation idea had been going on for quite some time. And at the time when Prabhupada had that conversation, I don't remember all the exact details, but it seemed to me that those local authorities were more or less doing everything and just asking Prabhupada, for approval. I'm pretty sure Prabhupada wasn't chanting on all of the beads for all of those people that were getting initiated at that time. I think even the locals might have been doing that at that point. But Prabhupada formalized it more at that stage. And this is where I'll talk about my institutional perspective on this. Like, the way I look at it is that Prabhupada said that, okay, so up until now, you've been recommending people, and based on your recommendation, I've accepted. From now on, you don't need to ask me. You just initiate them. You do everything, sort of thing. And he says, make sure you put their names into the book of initiated disciples. So for me, it seemed like this type of initiation was more like a membership right, that this person has, shown that they are qualified to become an official member of ISKCON, therefore they get to be initiated, they get their name in the book, they are an official member. It didn't seem to me like it was how should I say? It wasn't so much about the personal relationship as a guiding, guru and that sort of thing. It seemed very, you could say, impersonal in a sense, a more institutional type of idea. Prabhupada said, yeah, if you're in that zone, that person can initiate you. If you're in that zone, you can get initiated by that person. Prabhupada was the guru, and whoever put them in the book, it didn't really matter too much. So this is just maybe one perspective. I'm not sure what you think about that.
Well, I think we're already dealing with the challenges of massive scale. And so, yes, as you referred to earlier, Hari Bhaktivilas will say, disciples should live with the guru for a year and then take initiation. Well, that's just not feasible when you have thousands and thousands of people spread all over the world. So Prabhupada came up with some systems. He remained obviously the guide through his lectures, through his books. People were also able to write letters. They were able to visit him and maybe come to a part of the world where he was there, or occasionally he might visit them. But yes, he had to have some way that his physical limitations of only being in one place at one time was not restricting the growth of the movement. And therefore, as we discussed last time, empowerment. And he saw that the structure of the society was meant to be a network of guidance, a network of shelter, and a network of support, infused with his teachings. But yes, he was having to look to scale. That seems to be the inevitable challenge. I'd like to look at the events, immediately in the aftermath. But do you still have some response to what I was saying there?
Yeah, one other thing which also came to mind is that in practical terms, the temple president was like the guru for the disciples in those days. And this again talks about the shift in demographics, which we'll talk about as well, where in the early days, everyone lived in the temple, whether you were married or not married or whatever. You lived in the temple and your immediate authority was the temple president, and there was a strong sense of obedience to that person. And in effective terms, they were the guru. Whatever they said, you kind of had to do it, and they were considered the representative of Prabhupada.
Well, it was an arrangement that was designed for local pastoral care. Whether or not that was being nicely exercised, or whether people saw or had faith that their temple president, fully represented the guru, and that obedience to the temple president equaled obedience to the guru. There is an interesting conversation where I believe Gurudas and Harikesh are asking Prabhupada about this, and they're sort of saying, hey, but what if we don't think he's properly following himself? And Prabhupada says something to the effect of, that's not for you to evaluate. You just follow. If there is some discrepancy, I'll sort it out, or Krishna will sort it out in due course. And you can't be a disciple without discipline, was the way that Prabhupada kind of positioned it. So certainly Srila Prabhupada expected that the sort of chain of command, as you've described it, would be like that. And of course, the ashram head, it sort of harks back to what we started talking about in the very first session, that the guru-disciple relationship was always historically quite local. The local kids would go to the village guru, and the guru would educate them. And the idea of an international guru was unheard of.
Yeah.
And so, Prabhupada was spreading the movement in a time of emergency, and he had to make do with the available talent that he had. I'm sure if he had a network of lifelong practitioners at this time, he would have happily entrusted the pastoral care to people who were really fixed up and knowledgeable and so on. But he had, 7, 8, 9 year devotees. That's what he had.
On the topic of blindly following the guru, the local authority, there's also the case study of Bali Marana.
Yeah, the Toyota RS debacle.
Yeah, supposedly. Yeah, and eating chicken and all this kind of stuff, and devotees knew it was happening, but nobody said anything. And Prabhupada said, well, at least the seniors should have said something. So he was making a distinction that, maybe the juniors may not directly say something, but you know, in the etiquette, you approach your senior person, and the senior person, you know, can address it to someone or bring it up with Prabhupada.
I actually heard it slightly differently. I heard there were some devotees who raised the alarm, and there were also some devotees who thought, not my place. And Prabhupada commended both.
Okay.
He commended both. He said that, you know, both attitudes, you know, potentially have their place. So those who chose to speak out, it was a good thing that they did that. And those who chose to just knuckle down and not my business. Of course, for the well-being of the society, we do depend on those who will challenge something that is problematic. And that would be a mature leadership style that would encourage and welcome, let's call it loyal dissent. Now, I think the fact that we're talking about obedience to the local leader, you know, in principle, we can understand why Srila Prabhupada would have set that system up. In practice, a lot of those local leaders were not as strong in their pastoral care as they were in demanding obedience and pushing devotees sometimes beyond their limits, or sometimes exploiting the free labor, and even using the idea of you surrender to the guru's representative as a little bit of a weapon to enforce submission and so on. So there's certainly been some problems with neophytes operating under that kind of premise. That has been a challenge. Let's come back to the guru phenomenon. So when Srila Prabhupada did leave in November 1977, excuse me, I'm going to pass to you because my door's locked and my wife has just come home. you.
So you'll mostly wait for Dhamma Prabhu to come back in. Yeah. If I turn my computer on, I might see some comments as well. It should be useful. The computer's not talking to me. So.
Sorry about that. There we are.
Oh, come on.
And so there was perhaps a little bit of bewilderment initially. Okay, do you want me to turn one of your images off?
Yes, please.
Your phone might be giving us the clearest signal, and in fact the other one isn't even moving.
Yeah, I'll shut it down.
Oh, you are moving now. Oh, there we are. That's better, because we were getting some weird sound defect.
Sorry about that. I was just looking to check on Facebook to see if there's any comments while you were gone, but the whole thing started up again.
Yeah, so of course no one was really adequately prepared, and we could well imagine that, being 10-year devotees and suddenly being bereft of the spiritual leader who you'd committed your life to. Not that the spiritual master is ever, you know, disappears from the faithful disciple's life. Prabhupada always stressed Vani over Vapu, but still not having that practical guidance. And we also moved instantly from having that one trusted leader to now multiple leader. This is the first time that we're really testing, you know, how strong is the connection, how will the successors operate, how well will the movement remain intact with multiple leaders, and leaders that maybe a large proportion of the movement didn't have the same sort of regard for. I could well imagine if I was a peer of some of these newly minted gurus, and I can remember when they joined, and I've watched them in their spiritual life, I might suddenly be a little surprised that they're now, the transcendental via medium. Yeah, so several things happened, right? A couple of them didn't even wait for the GBC meetings in March, where they were going to decide exactly what the next steps were. A couple of them started initiating more or less straight away. There was some counsel that was sought around how might we best go about this. I believe some devotees went to Srila Sridhar Maharaj. There's a lot of controversy about you know, what he might have said or not said at that time. And a lot of people perhaps want to pin the blame on him in some ways. I don't like that train of thought. I've seen some of the transcripts of those conversations. But again, this was uncharted territory for everybody. I think what they did decide at the GBC meetings is now those 11 that had been the previous nominated Ritviks would become gurus in their own rights. But unfortunately, they took it way further. In some places, 11 Vyasasams were set up in temple rooms. I don't know how much room there was for anybody else to stand and, you know, have kirtan. I can't imagine 11 Vyasasams in some temple rooms. But at least in those zones that may have been shared, there were multiple Vyasasams. And they started to receive worship on a scale, or possibly even surpassing the scale that Srila Prabhupada had. And of course, they just thought, well, you know, the Guru's supposed to be worshipped as good as God. So we're just doing exactly what we saw. And this is, you know, good for everybody that it's like that. But there was a lot of rhetoric around, you know, these are Paramahamsa Gurus, these are Uttama Adhikaris. And there was a lot of enforced fealty, you know, where even the God brothers and God sisters were expected to worship the zonal acharyas, as they were called. Yeah, and of course, under threat of even things like exile, if they didn't do that. So it was very, very heavy-handed. There may have been other challenges too. I remember that Pradyumna, who had been Srila Prabhupada's one of his, I don't want to say editor, but what was he? He was
like a Sanskrit expert of some sort.
He was a scholar. Yeah, he would do a lot of the translations. He was meant to be completing the rest of Srimad Bhagavatam. He expressed a lot of disquiet about the standards that these new gurus were, you know, in terms of the ostentatious worship and so on, and was sort of excommunicated, or at least, you know, the Bhagavatam was taken off him. So it was a really, really rough time in that sense. I'll pause to see if you've got comments just as I go through those areas of history.
Yeah, and it was also very much enforced, like if you're in this area, you have to get initiated by this person. There was no choice that, you know, you're inspired by any particular person. It's like by your place of residence, your guru is decided. So that was also another factor. As I was saying before, you can imagine, you know, like a Prabhupada disciple has been worshipping Prabhupada, and then he's got these kind of like God brothers with all of their faults or whatever. Then all of a sudden, oh, now this person's overnight become a pure devotee just by the course of nature, and you have to surrender to that person as if they're the same as Prabhupada. It was a bit of a stretch for quite a few, and that's why many Prabhupada disciples left right away. Maybe other reasons also, but would be one of them for sure.
Yes, and of course, it wasn't very long before a number of them started to have crisis in their spiritual lives, their spiritual practice, maybe because of offenses, or just that, you know, the enormity of what they were taking on was actually too much for their determination and their discipline. Perhaps some of the worship went to their heads and so on. And we're talking about everything from, you know, criminal activities, LSD while on the Vyasasam. I mean, just crazy, crazy stuff. And I think perhaps of those 11, I haven't actually, you know, recently calculated, but only maybe 2 or 3 of them didn't undergo some kind of crisis. So I think as early as 1981, only 4 years after Srila Prabhupada departed, these problems happened. And by 1985, it was full-blown crisis. And of course, a lot of people started to look around outside of ISKCON to, well, are there more reliable pure devotees I could take shelter of being disappointed internally, which created its own, other challenges of kinds. We'll come back to that in a moment because I've got a whole bullet point about our relationship with other sanghas. As we looked at last time, the other sanghas, Srila Prabhupada had been very cautious about intermingling, but now it went beyond caution. There were edicts and strong words spoken and so on, and that was very unfortunate. And I think with all those guru fall downs, by 1985, so again, the movement's only 19 years old at this stage, and it's only 8 years after Srila Prabhupada left. There was something called the Guru Reform Movement, where, particularly in the US, a bunch of temple presidents were really worried about the way in which the new gurus were conducting themselves, the lack of separation between the GBC and the Acharya board. So the fact that people had both roles, guru and GBC member, that it's somehow imbalanced.
The Acharya board a bit more what that was.
So within the GBC, those who were Acharyas formed their own mini group called the Acharya board. And so it almost created a two-tier GBC.
The House of Lords type of thing, was that?
Something like that. And of course, they believed that, well, again, according to Shastra, no guru is ever accountable to some other than God and his own spiritual master. So the idea that they became laws unto themselves was a little bit of a challenge. But the main thing I wanted to talk about with the reform movement is levels of worship were reined in, and the field was opened up, so more and more people became gurus. And I think we've had a fairly steady number, more or less since 1986, 87, of about 80 or so active gurus. Maybe it's been more at a certain point. Maybe it is more now. It's certainly still a very small portion of that entire generation that have become gurus, but it is more of them. And I think the idea of the green mango is, it's a metaphor Srila Prabhupada used. As long as the mango remains connected to the tree, even if it's green at a certain point, it will fully ripen as long as it remains connected. So this idea that, okay, I might not yet be the Uttama Adhikari, capable of bestowing prema and Shuddhanam, but if I stay connected to Prabhupada, I can still be a viable medium to the disciplic succession. And I think this was probably to contest the growing sense that none of these people are Uttama Adhikaris. And Nectar of Instruction warns against taking initiation from anyone lower than an Uttama Adhikari, because it will be insufficient guidance. So this was the challenge, particularly because of the threat maybe from other institutions where we did have lifelong devotees like Srila Sridhar Maharaj of great stature. And, a lot of heads were turning in his direction to think, well, now that Srila Prabhupada's not at the helm, we don't trust these other guys, maybe we'll go to him. And I'll pause to see your thoughts at this time.
There's a few thoughts that come up. I'll just plant the seed about the distinction between the Diksha and Shiksha Guru. That's an important thing to keep in mind as we go. But one thing that particularly jumped out at me there was when you mentioned about Uttama Adhikari. It's one of my little things. One of my hobbies is categorizing and looking at patterns. Just like the 5 potent forms of devotional service, seeing how that aligns in different areas. So what I've noticed is that in the Vedic, or at least in reading Prabhupada's books, we pick up often that things are often described at 3 levels. They're described as Kanishta, Madhyama, and Uttama. Basically means like beginner, middle, and the top, literally. But what we do sometimes is we conflate all of those descriptions to be the same thing. And so I think it's important that in that particular verse where it says that you can get initiated by, a Madhyama or even a Kanishta, I think it says, but you won't be able to advance because they have insufficient guidance, right? I think it's important to look at the context of those three levels, which I don't have in front of me, and it's not something that's stuck in my mind. But, for example, it's described, they would approach Lord Chaitanya year after year, who was a devotee. And he said, anyone who chants Hare Krishna even once is a devotee. Okay, so that's like the Kanishta level. When they asked him, well, who's a devotee? He said, anyone who has taken initiation and, is taking a vow to chant the holy name, something like that. And then finally, who's a devotee? Then this is the Uttama level. It's someone who, when someone just sees them, they immediately chant Hare Krishna. And Prabhupada talked about how in our society, when anybody sees us because of the way we dress and things like that, they immediately say Hare Krishna. And so therefore you could say that, oh, look, if I'm dressed in a dhoti and someone sees me and said, look, there's a Hare Krishna, that I made them chant by looking at me, that means I'm Uttama, right? So point being that another distinction, for example, would be in the amount of knowledge and the faith. Someone with low faith may be easily convinced by someone else to give up their Krishna consciousness. Someone at the middle level has faith that no one will be able to, make them fall down or give it up, but they're not so strong in it that they're able to convince others. Right? And then the Uttama has got great faith and they're also able to convince others. So these are different levels, and someone may have those qualities, for example, in that knowledge framework. They're very good with the philosophy and so on. It doesn't necessarily mean they're the Maha Bhagavat that we hear in other places, that they're seeing Krishna at every moment. So I think it's just an important distinction between these different descriptions of three levels, that just because according to one criteria you might be considered Uttama doesn't necessarily mean that you are at the highest level of total realization of Krishna. So, it's just a distinction that I wanted to bring out here, because I think sometimes someone will say, oh, look at this person, they give such a good class. Oh, they must be seeing Krishna, face to face or something, which is something that it would be hard for us to know. But with this green mango idea, the idea of representing Prabhupada, and the idea that, that someone can't, if someone who's a Madhyama initiates you, you won't be able to advance to the same degree. It would be interesting to see the context of that quote. What are the qualifications that's given for a Uttama in that particular context?
Yeah, well, even in that verse, I'm glad you mentioned it. I'll just bring up the so here's a little bit of the same purport earlier on. When a neophyte devotee is actually initiated, engaged in devotional service by the orders of the spiritual master, he should be accepted immediately as a bona fide Vaishnav, and obeisance should be offered unto him. Out of many such Vaishnavas, one may be found to be very seriously engaged in the service of the Lord and strictly following all the regulative principles, chanting the prescribed numbers of rounds on japa beads, and always thinking of how to expand the Krishna Consciousness Movement. Such a Vaishnav should be accepted as an Uttama Adhikari, a highly advanced devotee, and his association should always be sought. So that doesn't appear to be the highest bar. It's not saying he's literally just walked out of Goloka to spend a little bit of time delivering us. He's going to introduce us to Krishna tomorrow, and so on. It sort of reinforces the green mango idea. I think because
it's also something that you can look at and you can make a judgment. Like, as a neophyte, naturally, if you're looking to get guidance from someone, then you don't know. How will you know the actual spiritual advancement of someone? You can only judge by the things that you can see, right? You don't know what's going on in someone's mind, if they're seeing Krishna every moment or not.
Well, and also the idea that diksha is a necessary component. As you said, shiksha also exists, and it's not like Srila Prabhupada's shiksha disappeared when when his physical body was laid into the earth. And so Prabhupada remaining the preeminent shiksha guru, someone else being one's diksha guru doesn't detract from that. Needless to say, though, if we took the total host of Vaishnavas around the planet and asked them, what their understanding is, how satisfied they are, what faith they have in the generation following Srila Prabhupada, we'd get a big range. Clearly, there are still many people joining the movement. Clearly, there are many getting initiated and many, enthused in their spiritual lives. There will be, a group of devotees, particularly those who experience the heartache of having their guru fall, who have lost faith in the GBC. GBC often forced reinitiation. Some people went through the heartache 2 or 3 times. So understandably, their faith is dented. And so it's also understandable how the Ritvik idea would have taken hold in an environment where people are feeling this sense of disappointment and only having faith in Prabhupada. Now, having had a front row seat for most of this, like I joined in 84, so I missed the earlier fall downs, but I did see, the Bhagavan fall down, him leaving the movement, from front and center. I was right there. I remember first hearing about the Ritvik idea from a devotee publication called the Vedic Village Review, and it was in about 1987, so a full 10 years after Srila Prabhupada left. Now, we know that those putting this idea forward, that Prabhupada is intended to be the Diksha Guru going forwards, and others are only ever qualified to be his representatives, they will point to even that conversation we spoke about. I can't remember if it's the 9th of May, but anyway, whatever it is, in May 1977, and say, well, Prabhupada never actually did give anybody the order. And they'll point to little passages in Srila Prabhupada's will. It's not clear to me, even if Srila Prabhupada signed that will, who actually composed the words in the will, but this idea of, I think there's some passage where it talks about someone who is a property trustee must be Prabhupada's disciple. There you go. There it is. That's proof that Prabhupada intended to always be the guru. So I think they really are, in my mind, clutching at straws here and looking at little scraps of evidence and ignoring the main thrust of what Srila Prabhupada said. But it's also fully understandable, nor has this idea gone away. And it won't go away as long as people don't have faith in the successes that are available. And of course, this is why also many people did turn to Srila Narayan Maharaj, Srila Sridhar Maharaj, and others. And of course, quite possibly because of Srila Prabhupada's earlier cautions about mixing with his god brothers, but possibly also because they were feeling threatened that someone else might hijack the movement, the GBC then came up with some very strong rhetoric, more or less denouncing Srila Sridhar Maharaj, Srila Narayan Maharaj. And I think maybe there was a quiet apology to Srila Sridhar Maharaj some years later, but the damage was really done. And certainly anyone joining the movement in those times was told very disparaging things about Gaudiya Math and so on. There are people who feel that institutional offenses were created in the unfair criticisms towards, for instance, Srila Sridhar Maharaj and so on. I'll pause to see what you have to think. We're obviously on bullet point number 2 now.
Yeah. Again, the idea of just going back, just a little bit back here, the idea of Shikha and Diksha is really important here. Like when it says in the will, for example, that it has to be a disciple of Prabhupada, in perpetuity. So the idea is that the Ritvik position would be that it means that in the future those will be initiated by Prabhupada. That'll be Diksha. But you could be a disciple of Prabhupada without being initiated if you are following the instructions of Prabhupada as a Shiksha disciple. Right?
It's also worth saying that a will is generally for the immediate transition period. It's not a declaration or policy for the rest of, the society's endurance. Sorry, I cut you off there.
Trying to catch my train of thought.
Apologies.
No, it wasn't you. I paused and then I lost my thought. Did it just come back? So, yeah, Prabhupada's disciples and Shiksha disciples. Oh, it occurs to me that over time, the GBC seems to have been revising everything more and more towards what the Ritvik position is. Like initially it was like, oh, okay, so now these guys are equal to Prabhupada and you have to bow down and worship him or else. And then over time it's like, oh, actually, maybe we weren't quite right about the zonal acharya system. So what we'll do is we'll have a lot more gurus and we'll kind of downgrade their position. They're kind of like a little bit more above us, above the common person, and that they need to be authorized by the society, but they're still having big Vyasa Puja ceremonies and so on. And then they pass laws that you shouldn't have a big Vyasa Puja and it shouldn't be in the temple room, and restricting more and more. And it just seems that more and more over time it seems to be heading more towards a Ritvik position, and especially emphasizing Prabhupada, what is the word? Preeminent for all members of ISKCON, the ISKCON disciple course. It seems to be more and more emphasizing that Prabhupada is the guru for everybody, and the Diksha gurus at the current time are his representatives. So I don't know, it just seems to be more and more it's heading towards that. And I just wonder if we kind of put ourselves in a few generations ahead, how it would look, because now we've got the immediate disciples of Prabhupada who are initiating predominantly. But if we go a couple of generations down, what would it look like? What will the parampara be looking like on the altar? How many pictures will there be, going down and down and down? Or will it be like Prabhupada will be the one who's on the altar and we maybe have a picture of our own guru or something, you know what I mean?
Well, I think that is the case with things like the Madhva Sampradaya and the Ramanuja Sampradaya, where those personalities still loom larger than life, even though there might be more sort of modest worship of the current links. The challenge is, I think, that clarity about how succession will work has still not really been resolved. And despite many efforts, I think, that by the GBC in particular, to try and, put a definitive position forward, the Ritvik movement continues unabated. As I mentioned here on the fourth dot point, the other Gaudiya institutions are now also global. They have representatives in many locations. They have a presence in the West, and they have a certain attraction. And it's not only disillusioned former ISKCONites that are going there. It's devotees in their own right who may prefer. And many people, as we, I think, said last time, will comfortably mingle in the different sanghas. So the different sanghas are all here to stay. And I think there's still going to be probably ongoing debates about Guru Tattva. It would be good to see the movement finally get clarity, Diksha, Shiksha, and people to have clarity about those things. But, I don't know if that's ever going to happen. All these things will all rage on for millennia.
Yeah, there's also another element, and again, it comes back to this tension, which is where we started last week, between the institution and that personal relationship that someone has with their, I'll just say guru, with their spiritual mentor who is linking them up and guiding them towards Krishna. There was very much a mood when I started coming to ISKCON in the late 80s that if you're not in ISKCON, you're not going to go back to Godhead. You have to be part of the institution. It was very much the institution is a magic vehicle for getting you back to Godhead, and you can't trust it in other institutions. Which the years have gone by doesn't and it doesn't quite make so much sense to me anymore. An institution is there to serve the function of a devotee connecting with more advanced devotees and then, getting guidance to be with Krishna. We're an institution of itself, and just being a member, it's a little bit like, in the Catholic Church, they had these things called indulgences. If you did something wrong, you just pay a little bit of money and, you're kind of taken care of. It's almost like, oh yeah, well, if you can get a membership in this club, then you're all sorted, don't have to worry. But spiritual life is deeper than that, and I just felt that overemphasis on the institution being the all in all is challenging.
Well, and we talked about that in the very first episode, right? That the movement could be carried forward via institutions, but institutions can't claim ownership of the movement. We are the movement. And the reality now is the movement has several institutions representing it, all of them potentially in growth mode, maybe with slightly different flavors, slightly different, maybe even takes on the Siddhanta. That could well be the case. And yes, it would be arrogant to try and deny the authenticity or legitimacy of other branches and claim that we're the only legitimate game in town. Now, a lot of the reason of wanting to talk about those particular events on the Guru succession level is because probably from about the mid-80s onwards, there was, I'm calling it a mini collapse. It wasn't as spectacular as the contractions that we saw when the Sahajas came along and disrupted the first wave of the movement, or when Gaudiya Math fragmented. But at least many of the devotees who were my peers and contemporaries in the early 80s that had been disciples of Jayatirtha or Bhagavan, and obviously depending on your zone in the world, there might be others, over time just got despondent and left. And maybe they didn't bloop in the way that we often thought of it as an all or nothing exercise in the 60s and 70s. They retire to the fringe, and they might still come along to festival days. But in terms of giving their all to serve the movement, no, that's really not happening. They may not have completely lost all faith in Krishna, but they definitely, aren't feeling inspired by the guidance available, feeling perhaps very wary. So I've said here, mass exodus. I think we just lost a lot of people. I think up until about the mid-80s, the movement was still growing at a rate of knots. If I think about the UK, we got Chaitanya College, there were touring, temples, there were these temples on wheels that were going around, there was massive festivals. And then by the late 80s, so many of those devotees had gone, and it represented a couple of, I think anyway, one of the challenges that happened, and this may have been a policy decision in the early 80s, is much of the book distribution got replaced by paraphernalia distribution, where people would sell paintings or stickers or other things to raise money. And the Harinams and the preaching sort of took a back seat. When all of that manpower left, sorry, go ahead.
So the basis.
That's the basis. when all of that manpower left, and when I say left, I mean there were several things that happened. A lot of people were getting to an age where they might marry, or they no longer felt like living the surrendered life of the ashram, and they wanted to make sure they'd made proper provision for themselves. So suddenly there was an exodus out of the ashrams to the community, and temples now were starting to have staffing issues. And that also brought with them, because the economic model had been street collections for the most part, that also brought this challenge of, what do we now do for our economy? So there was a lot of financial crisis all around the world in the wake of the gurus leaving and the unsettlement in the generation that had been their initiated disciples. But this also coincided with the Indian diaspora really taking off around the world, and finding ISKCON and loving the ISKCON model, you know, the beautiful temples, the beautiful worship, the festivals, and so on. And temples shifted their economic reliance away from things like book distribution and paraphernalia sales, where they just didn't even have the manpower, so it wasn't even an option, over to patrons, Indian donations, catering to the Indian community. And in many ways, this also exacerbated the sense of disconnection many of those old ashramites felt, where they felt that they were not as valued as members of the community as the cashed up Indian community that were generously giving. And so many of them felt, oh, the movement has become a Hindu organization. It's lost its original preaching zeal. And I think there was a lot of things going on. So I've mentioned here the loss of innocence. Maybe we no longer felt like we wanted to promote the ashram model, because many of the people who had lived in the ashram previously thought, well, that didn't actually work out that well for me. I was used up for a few years and then spat out and had to fend for myself out in the real world. Do I want to recommend that to anybody? Do I want to recommend that you surrender and give your life, and maybe you'll be let down by the person I told you to surrender to? Sorry, Krishnendra, go ahead.
That feeling that I gave so many of my years of my life to the movement, then what have I got to show for it now? I'm starting from scratch to build up my economic basis and, you know, struggle in my family life, and that kind of mentality is not uncommon.
Of course, it's not universal. So maybe India hasn't had the same number of setbacks, and it might still have a thriving ashram model. But I know, for instance, Western Europe, Northern Europe were somewhat decimated by Bhagavan's departure, by Harikesha's departure, and they may not have even yet properly recovered. And in those places, maybe there are exceptions, but the ashram model, compared to what it used to be, where it used to be 95% plus of the movement lived in the ashram as surrendered volunteers, now maybe it's 2% of the population of the movement live in the ashrams, and it's seen as quite, you know, a transitory phase. It's no longer considered to be a bloop if you move out and get married and take up a job and so on. So you could say, on the one hand, that's progress, that we're recognizing all these other stations of life can be represented, but perhaps it should be a worry that very few people want to undertake the brahmacharya training. Maybe people didn't get much out of it. They didn't feel it set them up for life. I'll pause for you, Krishnendra.
I mean, it's very rare around the world these days to actually find a genuine brahmachari ashram. In many places in the Western countries, you'll find that they have imported usually unmarried men from India to become the pujari, who do their service for some time until they get their green card, their immigration status, and then they go and get a job and get married and move on. It's like a career path. It's not the same thing as in the old days where people were joining the ashram to learn about how to become Krishna conscious, and, you know, really had that missionary spirit, and had that genuine desire to get the spiritual training and everything. It's more like a paid help position these days, and a career option.
And this issue around the Hinduization, now I'm using that with parentheses because I think there's a lot of problematic thinking in here. I think some of the thinking is if a Western person who had previously had no exposure to Sanatana Dharma learns about Krishna consciousness, you know, hands in the life they might have otherwise lived and joins the movement and gives their whole life to the movement, even if that giving whole life may have just been for about 5 or 10 years, that's definitely seen as a different kind of preaching success than someone who'd been around Sanatana Dharma maybe in some shape or form their whole life and then simply started to frequent ISKCON temples. I think there may be some embedded notions that those people from the Indian diaspora, even if they frequent ISKCON, may not give up all of their other philosophical or even institutional affiliations. They might still have on their altar at home Sai Baba or, you know, some other person. So I think there is a misgiving that sometimes is uninformed that the Hindu devotee is not a real devotee who's making the same level of commitment. I think there's a lot of closet racism in there where we're not seeing their devotion to be on a par or not thinking that their participation in the movement is as significant in some ways. And of course, this rages on as well, and we'll have the various debates like the Krishna West idea of a strategy, which is maybe we've been too accommodating of, or, you know, too embracing of Indian ways, Indian food, Indian dress, and this becomes a hurdle for, you know, the non-Indian. I do think it's really important that we retain the distinction that anyone who gives their life to Lord Chaitanya's movement is a Vaishnava and worthy of our deepest respect, and we shouldn't be overly preoccupied with their sort of cultural backgrounds. But I think it also represents this idea that many of those early devotees now feel disenfranchised and left out of the conversation or the influence that they think they should have, because a lot of that influence has now gone to donors who happen to be members of the Indian community because they're very generous. Anyway, I'll pause to see what you have to say about all of that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuance in this discussion for sure. In the early days, there were comments by Prabhupada warning about letting the Indians get involved. And if you think about the context at that time, it makes sense that the devotees didn't have the discrimination to know what the, you know, the real standard was. So some person who may not have the same philosophical understanding that Prabhupada was trying to teach us, but, you know, has some of that Indian culture, could derail things. I think the way things are now, there's still some risk of, you know, devotees thinking that how they grew up is what Krishna consciousness is. And then there could be some influence, but I think in general the society has established itself a lot more now that it's not as much at risk of, certainly not at risk of a major deviation in that sense.
And the reality is that, sorry, go ahead, Krishna. No, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, so that's just one perspective of it, you know, that Prabhupada was protecting his young movement from them being, you know, cheated by something that looked the same but may not be the same. So I don't think the risk of that is as much now. But certainly, Prabhupada also indicated that Africa, I remember in particular, Prabhupada was criticizing the devotees for preaching to the Indians. He said, like, we didn't come to Africa to preach to Indian people. We want to reach the local people. And I think that's important to maintain that as an important part of the mission. And although it may seem like you were alluding to here, somewhat racist or a little bit unfair, that if an African person becomes a devotee, it's worth more than an Indian person, you know, becoming part of our movement. At the same time, it is quite an accomplishment, and that's, you know, Prabhupada's mission was to spread Krishna consciousness beyond just the those of Indian descent. So just throw that in.
Yeah, and the thing is, we shouldn't view it as a problem that members of the Indian diaspora have fallen in love with the Krishna Consciousness Movement. That was always likely. And there's nothing wrong with it. What I suppose is the legitimate concern is, why is it that we're not having the same cut through with the non-Indian devotees around the world, when in fact the early days of the movement, it was all new converts from Western backgrounds and so on. And also, how can each constituency within the Krishna Consciousness Movement feel that its needs are valued, its participation is valued and accommodated, and whether there's almost a sense that, you know, someone who's a donor is valued more maybe than someone who gave so many years voluntarily, and that's sort of cast aside. So I think this is a leadership challenge. Every temple should think carefully about all the constituents it's there to serve, and think carefully about how it offers its service. It is fair to say, though, that if the Indian community had not stepped up at the time when it did, there would have been a lot more temples closing around the world. And in many ways, they have shored it up. In that sense, there should be great gratitude. And I hope that one day this distinction of this is an Indian devotee, this is a Western devotee, becomes quite minimal. And the reality is, even though we're using terms like Indian diaspora, in many parts of the world now, we're talking second, third generation devotees who, for all intents and purposes, are just as Western. But yes, they might have rekindled an old family tradition of Krishna consciousness or Vaishnavism, as opposed to be converts. But there certainly is an issue about relevance to the non-Indian community, and we need to look at that. You could argue that we have a perfect package for the Indian community, a beautiful temple, most gorgeous levels of worship, kirtan, prasadam. I mean, from their perspective, that would be everything they'd be looking for in a spiritual experience. But it may not be the same package that a young spiritual seeker in the West would go, that's what I'm looking for. Nor have we necessarily optimized ourselves, not with just messaging for the average Westerner, but even to host and orient them to the temple when they come. So the average Westerner who might feel like venturing into one of our temples may be bombarded with a lot of foreign sounds and sights, see a host of Indian bodies, and hear language that they aren't familiar with. I'm not just talking about foreign language, but even Sanskrit quotes and terminology that's foreign to them, and just go, oh, okay, I don't know if I can fit into this. I don't know if this is for me. I don't see how this is super relevant for me. And this is a major strategic issue. As you said earlier, Prabhupada is Nivishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarani, specifically coming to give Krishna consciousness, the message of Gaura, to the West. And that needs to be rekindled. That's not prospering really at the moment, certainly in many parts of the world. All right, we may in fact not get past this slide today. Anyway, go on, Krishna.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very fortunate being here in Auckland because it's the home base of the Loft preaching programs, which I think have been quite successful in giving Krishna consciousness to those who are not Indian. I think one of the things that's natural with a human being is that we tend to like people who are like us. So, if we find someone that's similar to us, it's easier to become influenced and sort of associate with that person. If someone's very different, it might be interesting, but it's natural that like people associate with each other. And that's why you'll see that in a lot of these Christian churches, they'll have the Korean service or the the Samoan service or something. Like it's people of the same ethnic group will naturally associate together because they have a common cultural background and things that they can relate to. So in the loft in particular, I noticed that it's generally young people that are coming there, generally travelers or students, and there's something, they just create the environment which is attractive for those kinds of people. And it requires, like we were talking about before, the definition of a Uttama Adhikari, someone who's always thinking of how to spread the Krishna consciousness movement. It takes a little bit of novelty, not just doing the same thing that we've always done. And so I think it does require some segregation. Maybe that's a charged word for some people, but to create some safe space where people can have an opportunity to take up Krishna consciousness, where they might not be distracted by some of the cultural elements. Those things are there if someone wants to go there, but also providing the other opportunities, because not everyone will come through the same channels. So try having a lot of different opportunities for people to attract different people rather than just having one way.
Yeah, and you've used the word channels there, which is that sort of marketing term. So yes, we do have different demographics, and they might benefit from different approaches and different packages. As you said, there are devotees who are experimenting with different models. The loft would be an example. The Bhakti Center might be an example in New York, and so on. Krishna West, is a very intentional example of trying to optimize the offering around a particular demographic, and we've yet to see how that works. I would argue that what young Westerners seem to be especially responding to, and not exclusively young Westerners, but one thing that does seem to be the most attractive offering that the movement has are kirtans, because people are quite experiential over being philosophically inclined. Kirtan seems to be super attractive for lots of people. And when we get to looking at what do we do well and what could we further amplify, it's the first cab off the rank is the renaissance of the kirtan movement, which is, I think, already underway. It seems to be going quite well. Yeah, okay, so let's see if we can cover off these other things in the 90 minutes that we said we'd set aside for this session. We're really unpacking some of these to a large extent. So I've called it here the Guru business. So we're sort of returning. So post 1986 reforms, the field opens up. Initially, there is a reining in of some of the extravagant worship. I think we'd be fair to say that's crept back up, and we now have these, very gorgeous festivals and quite gorgeous lifestyles. We could argue by many that are in those guru roles, and there is the risk that we're dividing the world into haves and have-nots, where we've got often very wealthy gurus, even though they might be in the sannyas order, big celebrities that travel the world and command big turnouts whenever they arrive. There are a few non-sannyasis that also have achieved this celebrity status and the big crowds. But I worry that when Maharaj and his entourage breeze out of town, we go back to Sleepyville in many places, and it doesn't have the same sense of vibrancy. Many of those who perhaps joined at the same time and arguably may have as much guidance to offer, but haven't taken up the role of being Diksha Guru or are not yet approved by the board, as you were mentioning, they may just be cast aside or not seen as having much to offer. And we will talk in one of the future episodes about the importance of elders in any kind of community and giving them due respect. You talked about making the distinction between Diksha and Shiksha. It could be that if you have the license to be a Diksha guru, you essentially have the license to pick up a large following and maybe create quite a nice lifestyle for yourself. And Shiksha is a poor cousin by contrast, possibly seen as a little bit ho-hum, even though we're actually a Shiksha Parampara or Sampradaya. I'll pause to see what you have to say about all of that. Yeah.
It may sound a bit random, but it reminds me about taxis and Uber. You've had experience as well as me in this area. In New York, they used to have this thing that if you wanted to be a taxi driver, you had to get like a special license. And it was worth so much money to have this license to be able to, drive a cab in New York. And that you have to get it from someone who already has one. And the price was ridiculous. And then Uber just came along and started to pick up people and drop them off everywhere. And then suddenly that license that these big taxi drivers had suddenly became worth nothing. So I'm not sure what I'm suggesting here. Maybe I'm suggesting something, or maybe I'm not suggesting something, but it's like that now, that those that are given the Diksha license, it's a good business.
Yeah, well, and it's a long way away from the Jade Dekatore Kaha Krishna Upadesha Mara Gaya Guru Hoya Tara Aidesh, which is where we started last time. So this idea of empowering so many people to become spiritual guides, it seems to be a select few. And arguably, we might not have one cohesive movement so much as a confederation of temples and 80 individual guru movements, sometimes collaborative, but often competitive. Maybe it breaks down into cliques a little bit. And maybe they've become more powerful in many cases than the institution, certainly at a local level. So you mentioned the sort of parallel lines of authority. And, there is a question as to whether it's breeding any kind of unwholesome ambition and does threaten maybe the integrity of the movement as a holistic, joined up force, as opposed to a collecting ground for lots of individual leaders.
Well, it's interesting, again, in the history of the GBC and their decisions. Initially, they would appoint the official gurus, but that was problematic because so many of them fell down that it didn't look good. That, wait a minute, you approved this guy and he fell down. What's your problem? So, okay, now we don't approve gurus. If you want to get initiated, then you can ask us and we'll let you know if they, how is it? What's the word? There's a technical term for this.
We'll issue a no objection. We're not telling you this person is bona fide. We are telling you that there's no obvious reason for us to disallow them to offer their services.
Yeah, and so of course the next step down from that was to say that, look, buyer beware. It's like, you read the book, you study. I mean, like that's part of the idea they have behind this ISKCON Guru course, right? That you study this course and it'll teach you the things that you need to know so that you can shop safely in the marketplace of Guru. Something like that, right? Although they still have this no objection kind of idea.
Well, because of the history, they'll feel like we're not just going to have a free-for-all. We will still vet. We have a duty to protect the young, innocent person from obvious bogus people. And also rein the gurus in, so the gurus know that their license to operate is dependent on our approval. So I'm sure there's an element of that as well. But yes, it still causes a lot of consternation. And, a lot of devotees reasonably worry that if this person has been vetted by the GBC, does it obviate my responsibility to do my own due diligence? And, that's part of the challenge.
I was listening to Abhiram Prabhu yesterday. Was it? Anyway, I think it was on Friday. And he said something very interesting. He said that there was a point in time where he was doing some kind of business. he was going to different places, buying things and selling them or whatever it was. And then Tamar Krishna Maharaj brought it up with Prabhupada to say, oh, Prabhupada, Abhiram's doing business. He's going here and he's doing this and he's doing that. He's doing his own thing. And then apparently Prabhupada said, that's all right. He should be independent. He should be independent. I know what he say? No, he shouldn't be dependent, but not independent. So this is kind of like the tension that's going on here, is that essentially there's an anarchistic point of view, which is like, total centralization, let everybody do their own thing. But at the same time, there's something which there's also some sort of oversight and protection, and getting that balance, it seems to be very tricky. Like with the temples, Prabhupada said, they should be independently registered. They should, if they have to struggle to get going, well, that's fine. It'll make them strong. And, there's so many other reasons. But at the same time, he wanted the GBC to be the governing body to oversee everything. He wanted the sannyasis to visit the temples and check that the members of the temple are following the standard program that Prabhupada had established, things like that. So there's this tension between allowing people to do whatever the heck they want and at the same time having some kind of oversight. And it'll be interesting to see where that kind of ends up.
Well, yes, and Srila Prabhupada's choice to be non-controlling and very empowering is a very mature form of leadership as well. I know when I first became a manager, it wasn't that I was a control freak, but I didn't have the concept of releasing people to do what they can do. I had the concept of someone's here to take charge, someone's here to make decisions, other people are supposed to follow those decisions. It's what I call benign autocracy. I wasn't the malevolent autocrat that maybe I'd experienced. I was the benign autocrat. I would be caring, but it was very patriarchal and paternalistic, as opposed to freeing and inspiring and participatory, and let's involve people in the decision and get consensus and find a way forward. It was still a sort of command and control, even from a place of good interest. And I worry that because, and we'll look at this when we look at things that we need to stop doing as a movement, I think we still have a little bit of an aversion to secular knowledge about things like leadership. But we remain a little bit ignorant. Prabhupada actually had some natural leadership instincts, and maybe it does follow that if you're pure-hearted, that you do bypass the need for formal competence development. What's that verse? Yasya Devi, no. Yasyasti bhakti bhagavati kinchana sarvaigunas tatra samasatesura. So the pure devotee develops all the good qualities of the devas. So maybe Prabhupada didn't need to go to leadership school to learn how to be an empowering leader. He was naturally empowering because he had an expansive heart. It does worry me that we still have, a leaning towards command and control, even while tied with Prabhupada's don't be a controller and bureaucratic. The skills that go with how to empower aren't there. They're just not there. And so we still sometimes have kind of old school managerial behaviors. Let's get into the GBC thing. So I just wanted to put the guru business, I think, is a threat to the wholesome development of every person in the movement becoming an inspired preacher. I think it encourages maybe what we spoke about before, the empowered preachers versus the passive recipients, the fans, the gurupis, who just, turn up to Guru Maharaj's lectures but don't feel any compunction to spread the movement, or even that they have the capability or even expected to do anything other than be an adoring fan. Let's talk a little bit about the GBC. So as we said, the GBC was an idea that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur had, borrowed it from the railways. It was not successfully implemented within Gaudiya Math. Srila Prabhupada feels that that's why Gaudiya Math disintegrated, or at least was, severely scaled back from the, very vibrant movement it had been under Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. Prabhupada put ISKCON's GBC in place during his lifetime, 1970, and he would participate. At times he would veto the GBC decisions. At times he even he stood down the GBC body if he was concerned with how they'd gone about a particular decision. So it wasn't that it somehow became a flawless, perfect decision-making body, but the idea was it was a collective leadership body. And, some might argue that had there not been a GBC, the guru fall downs of the 80s might have been the death knell for the movement, but perhaps the existence of the GBC kept the movement intact to some extent. And the guru reforms of 1985, 86, perhaps also demonstrated that the GBC would be able to self-correct if it was starting to drift off course. So there's a whole bunch of things that suggest that the GBC structure has already demonstrated its enormous value in helping the movement withstand the threats of Atlas falling, so to speak. On the other hand, it could also be said that I remember as a TP in the 90s, I used to be eager to see what the GBC had actually come up with, their resolutions. I used to read them. I used to be excited when they were published. And there became a point where it just became more and more indifferent. And it could be that they've actually made so many poor decisions or been seen to possibly even be corrupt or asleep at the wheel that they've lost all credibility or influence. I'll pause just to see, what you think about that.
Yeah, I can share a similar experience, being interested in what the GBC had to say, what guidance and inspiration will we get from our managing authority. And now it's kind of like the resolutions come out and you're just like, oh yeah, business as usual.
Chocolate.
Hey. Yeah.
Chocolate.
Yeah, I remember that was the joke that someone was saying, that they had this big discussion about Guru Tattva, or who can initiate or whatever, and in the end they decided that chocolate's banned. But even aside from those sort of kind of like tasty subjects, it's just it's more like management sort of things, like, oh yeah, this person's now the thing, this guy's retired, that thing happened. You don't really get a sense of, hey, well, there's a sense that the GBC's got a vision and that we're really inspired to do something, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and certainly if you look at Srila Prabhupada's initial description of the GBC officer, it was, as you said, like the local representative of a spiritual master who would go, not controlling the temples, but would visit the temples to ensure that everyone's practicing nicely and is enthused. If you look at the GBC agendas, it seems to be much more sort of management, often quite reactive to issues. We don't see strategies coming out. And I'd have to say that there are certain decisions or indecisions which have really shown them to be in a bad light. And there is really a question mark about whether it is just your classic oligarchy that, is no longer able to really hear, doesn't have a grievance system, isn't really maybe that interested in other people's opinions. Maybe it's become hyper-focused on shoring up guru reputations and so on, rather than really leading the movement. A certain, things that I think have really damaged its credibility would be its, let's call it, non-responsiveness to child protection issues. sometimes even circling the wagons and protecting gurus who they acknowledge that actually transgress against children, and almost seeming to give them privileged protections. There's perhaps the reversal of, okay, we're going to let women initiate. No, in fact, it looks like India's threatening secession, so maybe we'll rethink that one. So the question is it actually a body that is really leading, or has it just become some almost ineffective legislative assembly, whereas gurus maybe have become more powerful, or the GBC ends up colluding with gurus? And is it really capable of providing the kind of leadership that the organization wants, or is its credibility now damaged to the point of total ineffectiveness? That's not an argument against having a GBC. It might be an argument for GBC reform, and re-examining how it's constituted and how it operates and those kind of things. I'll pause to see what you have to say on that front.
Yeah, it opens up a big question. I guess it's almost the session in itself about how the GBC, what was Prabhupada's intention with the GBC? What's its real purpose? Is it achieving its purpose? And if not, then how does it need to be restructured? But yeah, I mean, from my point of view, someone who's been practicing for many years, and I think I speak for many of my peers, we don't really care that much what the GB has to say, because it has nothing to do with our day-to-day life.
They've mostly become irrelevant.
Yeah, basically irrelevant. Like, the loft preaching's going on, the preaching at the temple's going on. It's got nothing to do with what the GBC has to say, really. I mean, even the GBC will pass resolutions, but nobody follows them anyway, because who cares?
I remember being sorry, you finish.
Oh, I mean, yeah. No, that's it. That's basically it.
I remember being particularly concerned when we were awaiting the outcome of a child protection matter regarding a guru. And, the GBC were meeting, and it took days, and apparently only a few minutes was spent on that issue, but a couple of days was spent on who gets which samadhi in which plot. And it really reminded me of the old Agundralbe conversation. They'll be squabbling over rooms. And so it felt like
struggling over tombs.
Squabbling over tombs instead, right? So it felt a little bit like, does this body of devotees really have the interests of the masses of the devotees, the leadership needs of the movement as its priority? Or has it actually been overtaken by, interests of self-promotion, or where do I fit, or, what's my territory, or whatever? What are my needs and interests? Let's move towards wrapping up with this last dot point, so we can finish under the 2 hours this time. So look, the internet, obviously the internet came into existence. The devotees were actually early adopters. I remember having email in like 92 or something like that. So we were really early in adopting this technology. And I think what we said with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta and Srila Prabhupada, Yukta Vairagya, we do like to uptake these technologies. Arguably, the internet, the World Wide Web, offers all kinds of new preaching vistas, and devotees should have a really good presence. And at least for the first, I don't know how many years, mostly the content about the Krishna Consciousness Movement on the internet was some kind of issues, grievances being taken out, information that you wouldn't want the average uninformed searcher on the internet to be looking at if they put any Krishna conscious term in. We're possibly devastating one of the most important preaching platforms, and possibly just because we didn't provide proper avenues for constructive grievance resolution. like Ghosties and other things like this, grievance channels. I think in recent years, possibly since more since COVID lockdowns, I think devotees have colonized the internet now with a lot more constructive material. However, there still are massive and often ugly arguments that spill out. And I wonder, some poor conditioned soul that stumbles across one of these discussion threads, what they might think of the movement and our temperaments and our behaviors and our beliefs or whatever. It would be nice to see, and we'll look at this when we look at positive recommendations, it would be nice to see some kind of cohesive internet strategy. But at least I think now there's a lot more wholesome content than there might have been at one point in time. It's worth observing that when Prabhupada first heard about telex machines, which I think was somewhere in between a telegram and a fax, it was some form of instant communication that could be used to get a message from A to B. Prabhupada was a bit wary, and he thought it would just be used for gossip, which turns out to be quite a prescient observation when we look at maybe the amount of time devotees are spending on the internet and the nature of some of the content that they put out or engage in. Arguably, it could be one of the most wonderful preaching platforms, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily being harnessed that way right now. Again, over to you, Krishnendu, having heard me waffle on.
Yeah, I mean, the internet is a huge opportunity, and now you have this AI coming and all these technologies. We need to be up to the mark with it. We have a ministry of book distribution naturally. Surprising there's not a ministry of internet preaching or something. But then it's not surprising considering what the GBC is focused on these days. But yeah, I mean, it's a massive opportunity. One thing that came to mind, you mentioned the COVID time. And you also, I'm just referring back to when devotees were feeling alienated because they felt that, all the new devotees that were coming to the temple were not like them and they couldn't kind of relate and they felt they didn't have a place anymore. So I think this is an area that the society hasn't really developed consciously, which is really important, which is cultivating community and cultivating small group discussions where people can express themselves. It's one of the 5 things of the purpose-driven church, and I can see that it's really important. You mentioned it here in terms of grievances. There's no avenue for someone to express their grievance in a constructive kind of a way, and so it just ends up on Facebook or on the internet or something like that. But if there's opportunities where devotees can actually get together and discuss person to person, it's totally different. The things you'll say in front of a real person are different from what you would say on a Facebook comment, right? As well as the actual chance for misunderstanding, as we know. When you put something on Facebook, it's not understood. There's no body language and all of those things. So I think there's a lot of value in, and this is probably something we can talk about, things that we could do more or we could start doing, is developing this, cultivating devotees getting together and developing relationships on a very personal level. And the reason I mentioned COVID and the internet is that we had the experience of what it's like to live life through the internet, and it's just not the same as actual in-person interactions. So that's just a little reflection on that.
One of the things you prompted me to think about just then is you said it's not surprising maybe that the GBC haven't really grabbed the internet as a deliberate sort of channel. And, we have a particular demographic constitution, let's say, of the GBC. It is changing as those devotees age, some are passing away, and maybe the baton is being passed to some younger members. But essentially, we did have a lot of pre-technological natives, people who weren't necessarily brought up with technology and wouldn't have those intuitions And maybe that will change over time. Well, it inevitably will change over time. But it raises the question mark of the demographic constitution of the GBC. At the moment, we might say it's
over time, we'll have that, what do you call it, generation gap issue. That if they're always the elders.
Issue. And we might say it's predominantly older men. Maybe it's still predominantly sannyasis who might not have social development instincts or certainly know-how. It might still be predominantly white rather than, maybe it's starting to rebalance in terms of Western and Indian now. But certainly, yes, it doesn't have younger people represented. It doesn't really have women represented. And it could be, let's say it could be more American than any other nation being represented in our global makeup, with everything that kind of goes with that. So look, let's take that this is looking at certain strands of our history. In many ways, we could say a lot of unresolved stuff that's happened since 1977 through to the modern day, that really brings us up to all the choices that we now might make. Some of it might be properly tackling these issues rather than allowing them to fester, or just play out, without any hand of design. What we will look in future sessions, and we're about to bring this session to a close, but we're going to look at what have we been doing well that we might keep doing, or amplify, or restore if we've perhaps taken our eye off the ball. We might also look at harmful things that we've been doing that we really need to stop doing. They actually impede the healthy development of the movement. And of course, we would also want to look at things that we haven't particularly been doing, or we really need to put a lot more effort into and start doing. So that'll be where we pick the thread up either next week or whenever we do part 3 of this series. I wanted to thank you again, Krishnendu, for not only, being a great conversational partner, but bringing all kinds of great insights to the table today. If we're thinking about just closing out today's session, and I guess thinking about particular themes from the history that we've looked at that we might take into the future, what are some of your sort of closing remarks? No pressure.
Yeah, no, what comes to mind is empowerment. It seems to me that in the initial period after Srila Prabhupada, the power was very much locked up with the small group of people, and that has expanded to some extent. But I think that verse you were quoting before, Yare Deke Taraka Krishna Upadesh, that we need to, and you were talking about leadership styles, I think we need to develop that a lot more as well, is have faith in devotees and allow them to take up more responsibility. And I personally feel that the role of the GBC should be less controlling, but more about supporting. It's just kind of what comes to mind.
Yeah, and when we look forwards, which is where we're going to spend the rest of the time in this series, maybe it's one more episode, maybe it's more, we definitely want to look at the significant role of leadership, which includes spiritual vitality. Have we become inspiring leaders that evoke faith and sustain faith? But then, yes, even just how we run the institution in a way that helps to preserve faith. I would argue that the adversities we've faced, some of it's down to just being undercooked spiritually, but some of it's just really bad managerial decisions, poorly made decisions representing competence gaps. Like, for instance, if we said there's not a great grievance channel, the leaders are perceived to not be listening, how much of that is a spiritual malady? I think I'm beyond what you mere mortal can say. After all, I'm like God's representative over here. How much of it is that kind of arrogance and you know, sense of disproportionate ego or whatever. How much of it is I just don't have listening skills? I wouldn't even know how to conduct a good listening session. I couldn't help myself but jumping straight into advising or, you know, disagreeing with something that I don't like. So it's not at all obvious to me how much of it is a spiritual malady versus how much of it is a skills gap. And it's probably both. And actually moving forward on either one front would already represent progress. Moving forward on both fronts is what is really need to, you know, to address that sense of disconnection.
Character and competence. And what I would add as well is that the systems that we set up can reinforce those things too. They're very important. And I feel the way the GBC is set up, it's not supporting the growth of both of those areas.
So look, I have a massive thank you, not just to Krishnendu, for anyone who's watched this or will watch it in the future. Again, please comment, please share if you think it's useful and you think other people might be involved in the conversation. Obviously, you know, Nendu and I have our own subjective take on the history, both in terms of what we're aware of and also the significance we attach to the various events. Is by no means the definitive history. We'd welcome other people's perspectives on significant events or the significance of those events in history. And when we go forward, it's even more the case. Like I've produced a few bullet points, as you saw today. Nendu is a constant source of great ideas. I'm looking for him to keep contributing things that might not be in my dot points. But I'd offer the same to anyone who watches this. We're not saying this as people who know the answer. We're trying to have a conversation and we're trying to stimulate through, you know, some carefully selected ideas, matters that we want everyone to have a closer look at and make some new decisions about, and hopefully build upon the success of the movement to date, propelling it forward to be even more powerful. And maybe, you know, putting to the sword some of the things that actually threaten the movement and impede its healthy development. All right, on that happy note, bearing in mind that the very next installment will all be looking forward. What do we do more of? What do we do less of? What do we do same of? Thank you very much to everybody, and Hare Krishna. We'll see you again soon.
I look forward to hearing the ideas that others will share.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're hoping. We're hoping that it stimulates all kinds of additional ideas and efforts. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.